Okay, I think it's 1:05 and we can begin. So greetings and good afternoon to everyone. My name is Tabiso and I'm going to chair this webinar in our webinar series for 2021. In today's session, our speaker is Rob Skinner, and the title of Rob's presentation is A Great Drama in the History of Human Development, the Ecological Perspective of British Anti-Colonial and Anti-Apartheid Activism in the 1950s. So just to briefly give context to Rob's presentation. So the paper from which Rob's presentation draws upon is an overview of a work in progress on the opening chapter of a book project examining the practices and ideologies of anti-colonialism in the 1950s and early 1960s, peace, decolonization, and the practice of solidarity. So in the book, Rob explores parallel strands of anti-colonial and peace movements and their entangled transnational connections, networks of activism that were largely, but not exclusively, reflections of a wide politics of decolonization. So Rob's focus in this paper comprises two key themes of the opening chapter of this work, which addresses the conceptual and epistemological frameworks of anti-colonial and peace activism, notions of development and civilization. So a brief bio on Rob. So Rob Skinner is a lecturer in modern history at the University of Bristol. So his research focuses on two connected but distinct interests, which is the politics of everyday life, especially which is connected with practices around food and eating, and the interactions between local and global activism, with a particular focus on transnational histories of South Africa over the course of the past century. So the structure for today's webinar will be like this. So we're going to allow Rob about 20 minutes to speak or detail his argument or arguments, after which we'll open the discussions to the floor. So after Rob has spoken for about 20 minutes, then I'll come in and just remind everyone the procedure of how we go about with the discussion. So thank you. Over to you, Rob.
Tabiso, thank you very much indeed. Okay, let me get my screen shared. Hopefully everyone can see that. Actually, I'm just going to kind of give a very, very quick introduction as you've kind of set up what I was going to start off by saying already, Tabiso. So thanks very much for that, because that's cut. I can cut the kind of first 5 minutes of my paper, which is brilliant. So essentially in the paper, I'm going to examine the ways in which this kind of the terminology that we can see in the title, and in particular the kind of terminology and discourses around development and civilization, was employed as a framework for mobilizing transnational engagement with struggles around race and human rights in Southern Africa in the early 1950s. I'm focusing in particular on the Anglican clergyman Michael Scott, and I could perhaps just very quickly say, of course, this is a very familiar ground for me, and in fact the kind of book project as a whole is a sort of, I guess one could say, sort of slightly indulgent retracing of some material of some kind of ground that I covered in my PhD in my first book, but trying to kind of set it into a broader context and trying to kind of problematize perhaps to a degree some of what I described at that point as the kind of the foundations of anti-apartheid. So expanding on those foundations and problematizing them a little. So Michael Scott, I have worked on, I've written quite a lot about, and it's going to be the focus again today. And in particular, I'm focusing on his contribution to the Penguin paperback Attitude to Africa, which was published in 1952. And the great drama of the paper, of today's paper's title, lay at the heart of the political vision for Southern Africa that's sketched out by Scott in his chapter of the book called British Responsibilities in Southern Africa. So let me just turn though, just quickly to a couple of kind of historiographical, sorry, that's my initial focus on kind of introducing the book that Tabisa has already done, but I just didn't give you a chance to have a quick look at this wonderful cartoon from the Accra Evening News from 1960, focusing on the subject of the kind of the penultimate chapter of the book, which is an attempt to send a team to protest the first French atom bomb test in 1959. But let me move on now just to talk about this opening chapter. I'm just going to kind of very quickly sketch over a couple of kind of historiographical strands, just to kind of make the point that these two themes, development and civilization, have actually been the focus of some very recent and important interventions in histories of Southern Africa and global histories of the period of the late 40s and 1950s. First of all, thinking of Bill Freund's book, 2018 book, looking at South African history in the 20th century from the perspective of South Africa as a developmental state. And what I want to do is kind of pick up on kind of the sense in which development is used in that book, and suggest that actually the more kind of humanitarian vision of development, which I think is actually quite kind of sidelined in Freund's account, is actually something that we really do need to continue to pay attention to, particularly when considering the role of the idea of development within activism and the mobilization of activism. And then the second point, the second kind of historiographical thread, is that around civilization, which is the subject of more recent publication by actually kind of a historian of modern Germany, Paul Betz, whose book Ruin and Renewal kind of explores the notion of civilization as a theme in kind of social thought in Britain, in Europe after the Second World War. But Betz's book also kind of really it sort of draws on or expands the notion of civilization, not simply to think in terms of coming to terms with what wasn't purely a European disaster, but was a particularly European crisis in the 1940s, but also sets this idea of kind of re-civilizing Europe after 1945, after the Second World War, in a much broader context in which he draws on and includes thinking around the politics of empire and colonialism alongside the attempt to kind of reconstruct Europe after the Second World War. And in the chapter of my book, I will be arguing that the notion of civilization was highly significant as a kind of framing concept for visions of progress and development, certainly on the part of activists in this period. Okay, right. So this is the cover. We can see the cover of Attitude to Africa, the book that I've already introduced. Really provided a manifesto of sorts for the Africa Bureau, often described as a kind of left liberal organization in Britain. It was set up in 1953, the year after the publication of this book, with really two broad aims. One, to provide support for delegations of African nationalist groups coming to visit the UK during the 1950s, and then secondly to kind of communicate to the British public political developments, particularly in Africa itself. The movement was, the organisation, although described as left liberal, as I've already said, is actually drew on supporters from across the political spectrum. Its founding chair was Baron Hemmingford, a conservative peer, a conservative member of the House of Lords and former master of Achimota College in Ghana. But Scott was, as its executive director, was really at the heart of the Africa Bureau as a movement. Shortly before it was launched, then this book, Attitude to Africa, was published. It was the product of a series of private discussions hosted by the editor of the Observer newspaper, David Astor, in his country home. And the book included contributions from the South African journalist Colin Legion and the West Indian development economist William Arthur Lewis. So Scott's contribution, as I said, focuses on Britain's responsibilities in Southern Africa and drew on his experiences in South Africa in the mid to late 1940s, as well as his campaigning efforts at the United Nations in support of the cause of the Herero peoples of Namibia. So the principal focus, the primary focus of Scott's chapter in this book concerns questions of human rights and democracy, but two key threads run through, as I've said already, those of civilization and development. Civilization in many respects is a kind of really important thread, and I'll come on to talk about that in a little bit more detail in a sec. But the idea of development was kind of drew on, that he describes in the chapter, drew on a series of schemes and ideas that he had been kind of literally carrying around in his pocket, in his bag, since his time as a kind of political activist in Johannesburg in the period between 1943 and 1945. He drew on proposals that have been central to his political activities, therefore, for at least a decade, and his involvement in wartime reformist movements in South Africa. What he retained from these years were two key schemes. The first was that for a kind of a vastly ambitious plan to irrigate the Okavango Delta in Botswana, that he promoted throughout his time in South Africa, which drew on the work of John Wellington, who was the head of geography at Wits, but also that of Frank Debenham, the Australian-born scientist, founder of the Scott Polar Research Institute at the University of Cambridge, who, close to his retirement in the late 1940s, decided to turn his attention to the water resources and ecologies of Central and Southern Africa, and exploring the development of possibilities of irrigation schemes in particular. So Scott goes at great length and great detail, quoting Debenham's enthusiasm for the Okavango scheme, which he suggested could make the region into a second Sudan. Sorry, excuse me. I managed to put my papers the wrong way around. Okay. According to Wellington's calculations, the Okavango had sufficient water to flow to support not only pasture but arable soil for the production of a huge array of different crops. And Scott called on consultations, including a round table of various experts, as well as local leaders, to discuss the possibilities for the scheme. More importantly, though, Scott's vision of development in the early 1950s was built on a model of regional development that he seems to have first encountered in the mid-1940s, drawing on the work of the US journalist, historian and social philosopher Lewis Mumford. Scott recalled in his 1958 autobiography the impact of Mumford's work, The Culture of Cities, on his thinking on South African urbanization and development. Regional development, as described by Mumford, would, Scott believed, build the foundations of a real renaissance of the social, cultural and economic life of the respective communities of South Africa. This 1940s version of the African Renaissance would be led by planned industrial development in rural areas, stimulating the expansion of the national economy and a surplus that could be invested in collective and community endeavours. What Mumford defined as the human region was a, and I quote, complex of geographic, economic and cultural elements. It had been given South African form by the economist and government advisor Andreas Prouvaire, who had drawn up a plan that divided the country into 7 distinct regions that Scott would describe as the basis for a policy of development that he believed stood in contrast with that of apartheid's notion of separate development. But for Scott, Mumford was not merely an inspiration for a rational model of scientific development. He would also turn to the American writer as he contemplated the existential challenges of the atomic age in the 1950s. Turning to Mumford's 1946 work, Program for Survival, Scott quotes, and quotes actually, it's in Scott's autobiography that I've cited here, but it's actually a quote directly from Mumford's work. The most complete transformation of the self must take place among those who have been least concerned with the psychological and moral nature of man. Unless we can arouse our imagination sufficiently to picture the consequences of our acts, there is not further enormity that we might not as a people be ready to commit. So there's a hint here, or the beginning, this is the kind of first indication really, that what when Scott talks about and introduces notions of scientific management and development, it's always very, very never far. We're always never far away from a kind of spiritual, the subject of the spirit, the subject of the kind of metaphysical. And Scott at all times, draws on work like Mumford's to pull together the kind of fairly complex threads of Scott's political and social worldview, Christianity, material justice, Gandhian pacifism, and scientific rationality. And above all, I think that Mumford's ideas provide a framework for understanding Scott's own entangled vision of civilization and development, to which I'll turn to now. So the concept of civilization is a ubiquitous presence in Scott's writing on South Africa and Southern Africa more generally in the years after 1945. Before he left South Africa to address the UN Trusteeship Committee for the first time in 1948, he borrowed a film camera from the South African photographer Leon Levson and made a film that would be shown to delegates in New York under the title Civilization on Trial in South Africa. And the image in the center is a still from that film. And in the title of the film, Scott deliberately echoed the title of the world historian Arnold Toynbee's book of the same year. And what we can see really is this sort of, there is a sort of declinist version and a kind of feeling of history that is often associated with Toynbee and his notion of civilization on trial, the idea that the world is kind of entering a period of crisis. And I think that's important to kind of bear in mind. But I think it's also, we shouldn't kind of get too distracted by this idea of a kind of declinist language that we see in Toynbee. And in fact, I think the hint of the influence of Toynbee in Scott's writing reveals something of the twofold meaning of civilization for many who were coming to think of trying to come to terms with the aftermath of the Second World War. On the one hand, so Toynbee's notion of civilization spoke to a universal and shared historical story, while on the other, it represented a notion of human collective identity above and beyond the level of the nation state, and what Toynbee called the idolatrous worship of state power. Now, taken together, Toynbee's work, which was extraordinarily popular in its day, provided for the peoples of Europe and indeed for Scott, as Paul Betts has suggested in the opening of his recent book, Toynbee provided a sense of communal identity and broader historical purpose beyond the nation state. So these notions of civilization, they have to a certain extent, and indeed even in Scott, a kind of racialized tinge to them, taint to them, but they also provide a way of thinking that's beyond the nation state. And I think often we see the post-1945 period as the kind of glory years of the expansion of the nation state, the time when the nation state, the period in world history when the nation state becomes ubiquitous. And in fact, we have these alternative visions of human collectivity that people like Toynbee are presenting. For Scott, it also shaped his understanding, though, of planning, progress, and development. In Africa, he writes in 1952, a great drama in the history of human development is being enacted. This was a narrative of world history that was influenced by Toynbee's notions of civilization, one in which the story of struggle against imperialism was one of irreconcilable clashing patchwork of civilizations, in which the freedom and ambition of one racial group seems inevitably opposed to the existence or security of another. So as I say, there's a kind of one sense in which notion of civilization becomes kind of racialized, exclusive, but on the other hand, we can still see it as a way of thinking about the world through a kind of broadened lens, perhaps we might call today a global lens. But then there's one other term that Scott refers to throughout this chapter that I think is particularly interesting and speaks to this broadening of vision. And this is the term ecology. When discussing the practical challenges of development, Scott suggests that officials and administrators needed to combine, quotes, scientific dispatchment with scientific detachment with a greater a confident spiritual approach. As a consequence, he argued in Attitude to Africa for a greater appreciation of the need for this faith and these values, and for an ecological perspective of Africa's problems. The conservation and balanced use of Africa's soil, minerals, and other natural resources cannot be achieved by technique alone, nor by any mechanical means, nor can it be achieved if initially there is disregard of the human factor. In Scott's view, taking the human factor into account meant equality of opportunity in training and education, equality before the law, and a rejection of racialized models of social relations. But while the meaning of the passage as a whole seems fairly straightforward, social development needed to accompany economic development and modernization, and that development was incompatible with systems of racial differentiation, the use and language of ecology and conservation is worthy of deeper examination. What did ecology mean to Scott and his contemporaries? Its usage in Scott's chapter is certainly compatible with Ernst Haeckel's 19th century coinage of the term to define the relationships between living organisms and their environments. But by the mid-20th century, it had also been applied in social and economic contexts by writers such as H.G. Wells, and is also used fleetingly in W.H. Auden's 1940 poem, The New Year Letter, an ominous account of the spiritual malaise that had been spawned by industrialism and had led ultimately to the Second World War. In Auden's poem, he talks of a Catholic ecology, which takes us in a kind of another direction entirely, perhaps. This then, though, was the context in which Scott's vision of development took shape, an agenda for progress amidst the chaos and spiritual collapse of the 1940s. And this notion of a kind of ecological thinking seems, speculating here, but seems to offer some possibilities for kind of tying together the various different strands of Scott's thinking. So development, Scott suggested, necessitated the conservation and balanced use of Africa's soil, minerals, and other natural resources, as the quote suggests. And as such, his use of the language of ecology may have spoken simply to the standard tropes of colonial environmentalism, soil erosion and the like. In this context, his call later in the chapter for, quote, the willing and intelligent cooperation of the African inhabitants in development begins to read not as social radicalism, but as something akin to the long-standing colonialist tactic of reducing indigenous societies to subjects of natural history. Scott's portraits of African society were indeed often marked by fears of detribalization, amongst his broad-ranging anxieties concerning modernity. He also envisaged development as a process of gradual adaptation, echoing the language of interwar segregationists. Scott's pamphlets and speeches of the late 1940s and early 1950s are suffused with the language of trusteeship, and where there are references to African voices, they tended to be fairly patrician in nature, individuals such as Hosea Kutako and Chikedi Kama, for example. So Scott's vision of ecology seems to be taking us at least down a kind of fairly familiar kind of colonialist discourse, line of colonialist discourse. But his audience was invariably not African, but international. And in the case of Attitude to Africa, specifically British. The development ideology that Scott preached sought to engender a new approach from within Britain that began with a desire to lay the foundation of a more stable civilization in Africa. Quote, his call was not simply to policymakers, but to all who had a stake in the project of development, and was, notwithstanding its obvious paternalism, centered on the conviction that African agendas, knowledge and cooperation were fundamental to its success. So it's ultimately a kind of contradictory discourse, I would suggest. But perhaps most importantly, it was a call for people in Britain to understand that development was inseparable from democracy. Scott began his account with an analysis of the crisis of empire, which he argued reflected the, and I quote, failure of democracy to become truly responsible and responsive to the economic needs and growing political aspirations of those peoples and the lands which history has placed under our rule and government. Moreover, these were failures of faith, Scott argued, lack of long-term visions and of any vision, values and of any vision of the ecological significance of what is being attempted. So this vision of ecology is something that Scott continually kind of returns to as a point of reference to his own audience, the audience of Britain, and the need for British to take account of their responsibilities, but to do so in a way that took account of an ecological vision. So I just want to kind of draw together to conclude by just kind of making three kind of concluding points, and I should start at the outset by saying this is the opening chapter of the book. So any kind of conclusions that I'm suggesting today are not by any means the kind of concluding overall points of the book. They're a kind of starting point, a jumping off point, really. And the key thing that actually I want to say is that this kind of, I think, complex, contradictory discourse that we can see in Scott's ideas about development and civilization are really not what underpins solidarity as practice, anti-colonial and peace activism as a kind of form of practice. And that actually, this is not about, the story I want to tell in my book is not one about of ideology, but one of practice and how. And so what I want to do here is going to introduce some of the kind of ways in which ideas are introduced that help shape practice, rather than being ideas that kind of are the kind of formative elements of activism and movements that we see emerging in the 50s. I think there is an argument to be made that we can see a kind of progressive conception of civilization within the kind of highly problematic aspects of the notion of civilization, and the kind of racialized tone, a tone that does kind of creep into even someone who, as kind of liberal as Scott. But this ecological dimension of development and progress, I think, feeds into something else, which is what we might call a kind of large-scale thinking. For the British audience that Scott is speaking to, he's asking people to imagine themselves on a world stage and to imagine the kind of sacrifices, the kind of great sacrifices and crisis that they've lived through in the 1940s to be something that's not simply about their own, just about their own kind of local experiences, but something that they need to broaden out and perceive in global terms. So the kind of world threats that are associated with ideas of civilization in Toynbee's work, the world threats that we can see referenced in Scott's discussions of development, and the world threats that we then encounter later in the book around the atomic age and nuclear weapons are fundamental to creating a global vision. That's it. I'm done.
Okay. Thank you very much, Rob. So we've come to the second part of our webinar. So we're going to open the discussion to the floor. So, and here is how we're going to do it. So we'll take rounds of questions. So each round will be comprised of 3 questions or comments. So the audience can make use of the hand raising feature on the Zoom platform, or you can also make use of the chat section. So you put your comments in the chat section and then I will read them for everyone so that we are all on the same page. So I guess I'll start. I have a comment to make. It's not a question per se, it's a comment, but I was just, for someone who identified as a liberal, the Scott's discourse on notions of civilization and ecology are somewhat disturbing, particularly on the minimal role or the missing voice of Africans in all that narrative. I guess, maybe you address it in the book or it's addressed, but I guess I would have loved to hear more on Africans, the Africans' voice in all this. especially, I mean, of course, he was targeting a British audience, but I would have loved to hear what Africans, how they contributed to all these notions of ecology and civilization.
Yeah, no, absolutely. No, I mean, it's a really good point, and I know I addressed it sort of fairly briefly, and I think for me, what's potentially even more problematic, it's not that there is an absence, because actually in a lot of Scots, right? So in the I think I just flashed through it quickly, but you can see a picture of Scott at the United Nations, and he has in his hand this kind of pamphlet entitled "In Face of Fear," which becomes the title of the kind of a book that was kind of essentially kind of ghostwritten by Frida Troop, Leon Livson's wife. And that book and his speeches at the UN are all about African voices. But the reason why I didn't want to kind of highlight that is because they are a particular kind of African voice. They speak to a particular kind of authority, and I feel that simply by kind of introducing that and presenting in a way would could potentially give the impression that actually Scott was heavily influenced by Africa, and indeed I think he would have felt that he was including the African voice in his political campaigning. But what he fails to do, I think, is actually get to grips with a kind of general African experience, and he continues to assume that he's speaking to that he's speaking to the kind of he's always speaking to an international audience, and that the kind of that power is always externalized. So even if even if there are African voices in his own political rhetoric, it's often they're kind of drawn in as witnesses to to their own victimization, rather than being kind of agents in their own politics, in their own political development. And I know that's not entirely. I think I'm being slightly unfair to Scott, but because he's actively determined to kind of to work alongside African political leaders and political movements as they emerge in the kind of 40s and 50s. He would not see himself as being someone who didn't see a place for the African voice. But I just think we have to be absolutely clear about how marginalized that voice is, even in someone like Scott.
So we have a comment here from Luke from Lucas in the chat section. So it says, I'm also interested in how this metropolitan thinking relates to particular African anti-colonial leaders' ideas about the environment. I'm thinking in particular about Amilcar Cabral and the emphasis on farming and food.
I don't know about any kind of direct relationship between Cabral's thinking and Cabral and Scott, so I wouldn't. I don't think there's any kind of direct connection. But I think Scott's vision is one of modernization, and I don't know. Maybe I'm being kind of slightly misguided, but I sort of often see Cabral's political ideologies as drawing quite heavily on kind of notions of peasant insurgency and the kind of the a belief in the kind of the radical and progressive power of the peasantry, whereas what Scott is often talking about is something that is very much a kind of process of modernization. It's very much kind of rooted in a kind of theories of modernization, and therefore what we encounter is yes, absolutely kind of a recognition of the needs of and the need to pay attention to what he continually describes as indigenous local communities, etc. But these are not kind of reified as the active agents or progressive forces of change. They are part of a process of modernization, which is always presented as a partnership, always presented as a kind of partnership between local, the indigenous on the one hand, and the external, the kind of the modern, the kind of scientific, knowledge that can really only be kind of provided by these external forces, the usual suspects of which I'm sure you're aware.
I guess also just to fill in that context of, because I have so many questions, particularly with the works of Scott. And after this, I think I will just have to read more just to discover the kind of context that he was writing on. I mean, I'm just interested also, was it a broader overview of the country, or was it specific locations within South Africa, and the Africans that he was talking to? I mean, I just want to get that whole broader context. And then there's also another hand from Rob. Let me just take these three, and then what I've said. Laura's hand is up also, and then a question and comment from Anne, and then we'll make that into a round, and then you can respond to these three. So, okay, let me read the one from Anne, and then after Anne, it will be you, Laura. So Anne says, thanks, Rob. Given Scott's emphasis on modernization, how is he situating these ideas alongside earlier government efforts at rural development? Thinking here about things like betterment policy. And then, okay, Laura, yes, you can go ahead and raise your question or comment.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, Rob. Very interesting. I was wondering if you could just, I think I missed some of the, or your explanation for the framing in terms of development versus developmentalism or developmental state. And particularly wanted to ask, following from that, if there's a clear sense of how Scott was thinking about the state and the role of the state. Thanks.
Thank you. Okay, shall I, Tabiso, you wanted me to kind of talk a little bit more about Scott. Can I kind of deal with Anne and Laura's comments, and then can you kind of just remind me again in a sec about the about your other kind of question, stroke comment. Yeah, Anne, betterment policy and rural development. It's kind of weird, you know. There's a sense in which Scott is extraordinarily keen to kind of promote ideas of rural development, and but on the other hand, there's very little detail. So on the one hand, there's lots of specific detail, particularly around like this Okavango Delta scheme, with specific kind of calls for kind of experimental farms in particular locations, and the Africa Bureau is actually, but later in the 50s does get kind of associates itself with a kind of experimental farm stroke mission center in Zimbabwe in the 50s, in southern Rhodesia, as was in the 50s. And but what's interesting is I don't think that he speaks in any real detail about kind of notions of rural development per se. His kind of, I guess, partly his kind of background in terms of understanding notions of development, I think is really significant insofar as that he kind of emerges out of two things, broadly speaking. One is his experience in Johannesburg in the 1940s, where his kind of primary concerns and the primary kind of focus of his activism is on urban issues, so issues around the teaching, working with teaching unions in particular, trades union issues more generally, education, health, those sort of perhaps more kind of, although obviously health and education are important in rural areas too, right? But in terms of the kind of the activist focus that it emerges out of a kind of urban activism. And that, I think, also is shaped by the work of his brother, who had nothing to do with South Africa, as far as I know, but was really really heavily involved in campaigning within cities in the UK around kind of improving the city. So I think a lot of what Scott is doing is focused on urban areas. He seems to kind of, where you encounter him in the countryside, he seems to find himself a little bit lost. Like he does, there's a wonderful kind of chapter in his autobiography where he talks about going into the farming areas of the Transvaal in the 40s, when he's still in South Africa, finding himself kind of getting caught up in calls to boycott Indian imports by white farmers. And he seems almost like totally kind of lost and not sure of his environment. So it's a very long-winded way of saying I don't think he says that much about rural development, essentially. And I think that it's kind of my reading of Scott is that he has a kind of quite a scattergun approach to particular issues, and he draws on writers that he's encountered, ideas that he's encountered, and kind of sticks with them. And he doesn't necessarily develop a kind of detailed or sophisticated kind of worldview that would take into account kind of questions like rural development. He just sees that as, so he'll look at Lewis Mumford writes, and drawing on the Scottish environmentalist Patrick Geddes writes about this notion of the valley profile, this idea that you can create kind of regions that are determined by natural geography, and so everything becomes kind of captured within the kind of the physical geography. And for Scott, the rural areas and rural development are kind of just part of this valley profile that also include the city. So it's so much of what he writes about kind of seems to come back to, how do we locate the city, and how do we recenter our understanding of South African political and social regions in ways that make more sense to both the kind of the natural landscape, the natural geography, and the climate, as well as the cities, the urban spaces that exist. So yeah, he doesn't talk about rural development in any sort of highly developed way, I don't think. Sorry, Laura, you were asking a little bit to kind of explain a little bit more about the relationship between development and developmentalism. And I think really, I mean, it's fairly, I think what I'm using it is a kind of fairly straightforward way, which is to say that actually what we have in terms of a kind of ideological influence that's coming through or can be understood in terms of Scott's work, what we encounter is notions of development as opposed to developmentalism. So in a sense, what we get much less of is an idea of the role of the state, and it becomes more of a kind of ideological vision of progress that seems to be disconnected from the mechanics of policy making. I think sometimes Scott seems to just assume that policymakers will just kind of do this stuff, guided by some kind of faith, and doesn't think carefully about the kind of the machinery of the state and kind of the operation of state institutions. He does not really think about the state, frankly, and he thinks about local experience and universal, big ideas, concepts. So democracy is important, but the mechanics of democracy is not something that's of a particular concern. Not saying it's not of a particular concern, but in fact, actually, he where he does talk about those kind of that form of politics and policy making, not in the context of the state, but in the context of international diplomatic engagement at the United Nations. He just he seems to kind of spiral into a kind of pit of depression, about the fact that actually nothing ever gets done, and that form of politics, that form of diplomacy and kind of realpolitik is something that he sees as simply being part of this sort of spiral of kind of that leads us away from the kind of more spiritually informed, spiritually engaged kind of way of doing politics that is at the core of his own kind of being and belief and faith. So I feel like I said exactly the same thing to both you and Anne, which is he doesn't talk about it, but genuinely he says much less than you'd expect about the practical things that one would need to be doing in order to promote these kind of grand ideas and visions that he's essentially trying to sell to the people of Britain in this chapter.
Okay, thank you, Rob. So we're gonna take another round, and there's a comment from Joku, which we will start this round with. Well, it's a question. So Njoku says, okay, also there's another hand from Lindelo. I see you. After I've read Njoku's question, you can go ahead and raise your question or comment. So Njoku says, can you tell us some more background about Scott? What is animating him in his work, where he is located, etc., when he writes this work? Okay, so and then Lindelwa, you can go ahead and raise your comment or question.
Thank you, Tabi. So sorry, I'm too lazy to type. I want to thank obviously Prof. Skinner for everything. I never knew anything about Michael Scott. As a music scholar, I knew more about Trevor Huddleston. And that kind of gets me to what I want to ask, and it's about the photograph that you showed. Because most of the photographs we see of Trevor Huddleston have Trevor Huddleston in them. And some of the photograph that you showed us today, it's kind of like, you can see it now in like National Geographic on a plane on the way to. So I wanted to ask, to what degree, even though they didn't hook up what Scott was saying about we can't just be technocratic about development, the human factor, et cetera, to some degree, there's certain bits of his argument that have caught ground. Can you say something about that? I'm thinking about it because it's Marvin Gaye's What's Happening Brothers' 50th birthday. And of course, there's that huge ecological thing to do with solidarity that we are able to celebrate today. If you could say something about other photographs that came from that project, how, despite whatever happened in terms of words, how they sort of caught hold in terms of how developmental doctrines of development, as it were imagined in Britain at that time.
Cool,
okay,
thank you. Yeah, I can.
Sorry, Rob.
Take those two.
Can I just take another one just to complete this round from Jonathan Hislop? I see his hand has been up. So yes, Jonathan, you can go ahead.
Hi, Rob. There are actually three things I wanted to ask about. One is theology. How do we place Scott in the sort of Anglican tradition of social activism, which I think has always been interestingly ambiguous between progressivism and sort of romantic reactionary view of the world looking for an organic social order? Second thing is, and this is maybe too broad really to answer, so you could just take it as a comment. But I mean, I think one of the interesting things about this era, especially for people of Scott's generation, is the whole interaction between ideas of civilization in Marxism and liberalism, because the whole kind of popular front Marxism kind of thing is in a way is about the defense of civilization. And there's always this tension in there, I think, between the idea that there's a kind of common liberal left defense of civilization and the periods when the communists go to a much more sort of class struggle, we want to blow everything up kind of thing. And those things, I think, very kind of formative. And you can even see, a lot of people who come out of that era, they're always thinking about that thing. So for a lot of them, the whole kind of appeal of the Popular Front was the idea that in a way you could fudge the difference between Marxism and liberalism. And then the last thing I want to ask about is the sort of shadow of the New Deal, because it seems to me that there are two things here which particularly actually features, the central feature of New Deal policy, which are sort of soil conservation and waterworks, right? And that sort of globalization of New Deal ideas, I think is super important for models of progressivism around the world, really well after the New Deal, maybe even as far as the 60s.
Sure, thank you. Thank you. I'll just take those three in order, if that's okay. Sorry, the three questions, including the three from Jonathan. So first of all, Njogu, thanks very much. And more background on Scott. I could talk for another at least half an hour on background on Scott. I'll just say, I'll try and kind of capture it in kind of two things. One, I mean, he's an extraordinarily frustrating person to use as a kind of historical focus, because he seems, he recedes into the background. And actually, in a way, this kind of speaks to your kind of opening comment, Lindy Weller, as well, but that this, he's not in the picture, right? And he's described by many people who know him at the time as being this kind of diffident individual who kind of fades into the background, despite at the same time being a focus of political activism. So trying to kind of get to grips with what animates Scott is really hard. He ultimately, he struggles, his kind of struggle is between a kind of, what I've hinted at already, this notion of this struggle with politics in the raw, politics in the kind of the messy, mechanical form of politics, and this more kind of this idealized vision. He's always attracted to idealized visions, whether that be kind of, in fact, earlier in his life, communism, although he falls out of, he doesn't like communists and therefore kind of turns away from communism in the 1940s. But in the interwar period, he effectively joins the Communist Party of Great Britain, emerging out of his time as a priest in London, in East London. So he does kind of latch onto big visions, but he kind of latches onto them in a way that is not necessarily kind of clearly defined. It kind of, those visions kind of give him a sense of direction, but without providing necessarily a kind of fundamental worldview. So he gives very few clues actually as to his kind of his understanding of the world, except that it's a world that is moving away from a kind of a spiritual dimension, a spiritual factor, and that for him is the kind of the fundamental problem of the world. And he sees that kind of that one needs to reattune to the spiritual, whether that's through Christianity, through kind of Gandhian notions of passive resistance, or through and through addressing the kind of the existential threats to human and natural life that we encounter through the atomic weapons, and, as I'll come on to this in a bit, through what seems to hint at kind of early vestiges of environmentalism too. So I think that's what animates him, is this sort of tension between what he would describe as the spiritual and a kind of the kind of materialist and structural problems of the world, or challenges that the world faces during his lifetime. So I say I could go on at greater length, but I'm not sure if it would ever get any clearer than that. So turning to kind of Linda Weller, your question about these notions of development and ideology. I mean, I should say, one of the reasons that's a still from a film that I showed you, and one of the reasons why we don't see Scott is because he's behind the camera rather than being the person who is part of so it's not his activism is in this particular instance is in taking the film and sharing these images. There's some I don't know, Jonathan. I'm pretty sure I saw the film. You were in the room when I saw the film kind of years and years ago. It is quite a strange film, actually. And but what it captures, I think, is kind of essences of everyday life in South African townships in the 1940s in quite interesting ways that perhaps that differ quite markedly, I think, from the kind of images that we encounter, particularly ones with Huddleston in them in the 50s, in which there is more kind of gritty and perhaps kind of slightly less idealized imagery of not I don't think. Yeah, there's much grittier images of townships. I've found a scrap of film actually in the archives in Bristol. It comes from a collection of material from the Levson family that I'm almost certain is sort of Scott's first practices with the camera. It's one of those, one of those bits of film that you see when you don't quite know how a film camera works, and so it kind of spins round and some of it's upside down and some of it's really fast and then it slows down again. But there's some really kind of similar kinds of frames that you capture that kind of life in Johannesburg in the 40s, in the street world of Johannesburg in the 40s in kind of really interesting ways. But in terms of his kind of notions of development and the kind of ideological principles, I just want to kind of take this as an opportunity just to mention something that happens later, happens perhaps indeed in the kind of afterlife of the stuff that I'm looking at in the book, which is that Scott starts to touch on ground that I think feeds into environmentalist movements, environmentalist ideology of the 70s and 80s. He has a kind of an affiliation develops in the 60s with E.F. Schumacher, who of the kind of the small is beautiful kind of principles of kind of focusing down on kind of more kind of local, localist views of or localist paths towards overcoming the environmental threat of modernity. He begins to kind of explore questions around kind of intermediate development and things like that kind of begin to emerge in the 1960s. And so I think that what begins to happen is that he starts to become interested in what would be, I think, a kind of more recognizably kind of environmental developmentalism, if that's a phrase that has any kind of real meaning, but something that differs from the more kind of state-led kind of industrialized developmentalism that we kind of see, particularly in the kind of 1940s and 50s in places like in state-led developmentalism. So I think ideas of development that he begins to he moves towards eventually are ones that feed very closely to kind of modern notions of environmentalism. And by that point, though, his kind of political activity has shifted really away from the kind of activism that he undertakes in the 50s and 60s. Jonathan, I'll deal with your 3 points. Theology. I think I can answer the theological question quite quickly. Actually, Scott is very much of a kind of high Anglican background, kind of Anglo-Catholic. So this obviously has certain kind of theological meanings in terms of his approach to the relationship between the church and God. And I think it says something actually about the kind of somewhat patrician nature of his kind of his activism. This is something that's kind of led through an institution rather than something kind of more kind of Protestant vision of everyone having their own connection with God. And I'm stretching that point, I think, slightly, but yeah, Scott is absolutely of a kind of Anglo-Catholic background. But more importantly, I think that that Anglo-Catholicism, or that kind of high Anglican background, feeds his social activism. You know, that we encounter through a whole array of examples, that the kind of the certain social activism of the church often comes through that kind of high Anglican wing. Huddleston, for example, was also kind of high Anglican. So I think that's the sort of theological connection. I think it comes through this sense of connecting faith to social action. And you also get that, of course, in liberation theology from the 70s onwards to 60s, 70s onwards too, in a different context. Second point, the kind of questions about, you know, defending civilization. I think what I'd say here is that for me, the thing that's, I need to think more about that. But the reason why civilization kind of interests me in looking at this particular moment again is this idea that it actually provides this, you know, widest angle lens, or an extraordinarily wide angle lens for a kind of social imaginary or political imaginary. And that, however, you know, and that you can draw on that in a number of ways. That could be a kind of Marxist kind of broad angle vision, or it could indeed be a kind of more, you know, it could indeed be a kind of conservative vision but it's still imagining the world built on a kind of large scale. And for me, it's that scale that's important and significant. It's the fact that it's a way of thinking, it's a social, political imaginary, it's also a discourse that enables individuals to key into transnational and global activism. Okay, but I need to think more about this, about what you're saying about kind of different ways of defending civilization before I get to kind of finish this chapter. And then finally, the shadow of the New Deal. Right, okay, yeah, so the New Deal is throughout this text. I just didn't refer to it because I didn't want to kind of go, I want to try and keep quite focused into 20 minutes. But yeah, absolutely, you know, where he references Mumford's also, you know, talks about Tennessee Valley Authority all the time. Scott does exactly the same, but he does it in a way, as I keep coming back to, he does it in a way that where it's almost like this kind of, there's a magical thinking involved, in which the idea of the Tennessee Valley Authority, the idea of a New Deal, is just, it's a big idea, right? And it just happens. So Scott doesn't think, well, at least he doesn't talk in great depth about the practicalities of how you get the Tennessee Valley Authority to work. What were the politics of that on the ground? What were the kind of mechanics by which the New Deal is brought into being? Scott speaks very little about that, about those kind of practical institutional level work that needs to be done in order to, it's all about this kind of the grand vision. And I think that kind of, again, that interests me. There's actually the vision is there, but the practice is for other people to deal with. I think that's the all the questions I've answered to a degree, at least the questions that we had so far. Just spotted there's another comment. Yeah. Okay.
Okay. So we can get maybe the last round of comments, because our session ends at 2:15, so we can get last round of questions or comments. I mean, if there are none, Rob, you can also use this time just to, if you have any other closing remarks to mention, and then you can also use this time to do that. Okay.
Well, I mean, I have to say I'm incredibly grateful for everyone, first for kind of joining the session and paying attention. It's lovely to have a kind of great audience, and also for the questions are genuinely extraordinarily helpful. I mean, I should say, this is a work in progress. This is a work in progress that has been significantly impacted by current circumstances, by COVID, by lockdown, by, I was essentially at this stage of the book a year ago, and all of our archives locked down, and I was supposed to be in a position where I would go away last summer and do some more archival work and then be able to talk in much more depth and detail. So I'm really grateful for your kind of generous kind of questions and your generosity in letting me kind of deliver a work in progress in this forum, because it's been extraordinarily helpful, and I've kind of, you know, I feel the benefit of being able to kind of kickstart this project, which has really been kind of knocked sideways. So thank you so much for all of you.
Thank you, Rob. I mean, yeah, we will be looking forward to having that sequel or the complete project once it's ready. I mean, another announcement to make is that just to remind everyone, in case people are not aware, so the videos, these sessions are recorded and then they are uploaded onto our social media platforms. Then you can continue with engaging with this material via YouTube. So please subscribe and help us grow our channel. Yes, so we've come to the end of our session, unless if there are last closing remarks, then you can go ahead and do that. I saw there was an applause from Ariana. So yeah, if there are, I guess there are no last questions. I mean, we've come to the end of our session. Thank you again, Rob. Hopefully we get that sequel with the complete project.
Sorry, I'm muted. I just can't wait to come and join you again in person. This has been quite a frustrating year in some ways, although it has been great to join these seminars online. It's also been quite frustrating. So yeah, thanks a lot.
Thank you, Rob. So yeah, goodbye, everyone.